There is a shape pressed into the earth on every continent. You can find it in the coastal highlands of Sri Lanka, across the frozen steppes of western Siberia, etched along the carefully maintained shores of southern Japan, buried in the interior of North America, hundreds of miles from the nearest colonial settlement, and scattered through territories of Central Africa that European administrators reached only in the final decades of the 19th century. The shape does not drift or vary. It is always a perfectly symmetrical polygon with sharp angular projections radiating outward from a central mass, like a star drawn not by a romantic, but by a mathematician with something urgent to communicate. The angles repeat across thousands of miles, the proportions hold, and the scale, in case after documented case, is extraordinary. Official history has a clean explanation for all of this. The design is called Trace Italienne, a military engineering innovation that emerged from Renaissance Italy in the early 16th century, developed specifically to counter the growing destructive power of artillery. European colonial powers, the story goes, carried this design outward across their expanding empires over the following 3 centuries. Local builders, working under European direction or adapting transmitted plans, reproduced the pattern wherever colonial forces established control. A logical chain of transmission, an origin story with named engineers, dated treatises, and archival records behind it. But something in that explanation keeps pulling at a thread that the official account does not want you to follow. These structures appear on historical maps in territories where European forces had not yet, by their own records, established any meaningful presence. Building them required moving earth and stone at a scale that, when you actually do the arithmetic against the documented labor forces of those periods, does not always balance. And in locations far removed from the European colonial sphere, across the Indian subcontinent, through Southeast Asia, along the Pacific Rim, local historical traditions describe some of these fortifications not as colonial imports, but as structures that were already there, already old, before the first European ship appeared on the horizon. So what are we actually looking at? Welcome to Epoch Reset. My name is Elliot Carter, and this channel exists to follow the questions that serious researchers raise and that mainstream textbooks tend to step around. We do not manufacture mystery here, and we do not push claims further than the evidence will honestly support. But we also refuse to pretend that every uncomfortable discrepancy has been satisfactorily resolved, because in many cases it simply has not. If that is the kind of honest conversation you want, subscribe right now, because this is what we do every episode, and you do not want to arrive partway through the series and miss what came before. Today we are spending 6 chapters inside one of the most widespread and least discussed architectural anomalies in the entire historical record. One shape, every continent, a global pattern that has been hiding in plain sight for well over a century. And that, when you look at the full body of evidence, refuses to stay neatly inside the box that was built for it. Before we are done, I am going to walk you through what appears on a 19th century survey map in a territory that had, by the standard colonial timeline, not yet received any European engineering expedition. What is on that map is specific. What it implies is something I want you to evaluate for yourself. We will get there. But first, we need to understand the shape itself. The first thing that strikes a careful observer looking at star forts from above and satellite imagery has made careful looking far more accessible than it was even 30 years ago, is not just the unusual profile, but the extraordinary degree of geometric control embedded in the construction. These are not rough earthen ramparts heaped up in an emergency. They are not improvised walls thrown together from whatever material was at hand by soldiers who needed cover before dawn. They are precise geometric constructions built to tolerances that, in several well-documented and closely studied cases, would present a real challenge to a modern survey team working with contemporary leveling instruments across the same ground. The symmetry holds across structures that measure hundreds of meters from bastion tip to bastion tip. The angles are consistent within each structure and, more remarkably, consistent across structures separated by thousands of miles of ocean and cultural difference. The proportional relationships between different elements of the design, the projecting triangular bastions, the curtain walls connecting them, the surrounding ditches, the central polygon at the core, repeat with a regularity that points towards something more systematic than the rough copying of a design seen once at a distance. The fundamental engineering purpose of this design is the elimination of what military theorists call dead ground, the zones directly below and alongside any wall face where an attacker can shelter from defensive fire. In any traditional straight-walled or rounded fortification, those dead zones are a constant vulnerability. Defenders on top of a wall cannot depress their weapons enough to fire at enemies pressed against the base directly below them. Medieval siege engineers exploited this limitation routinely and effectively. The attackers who successfully reached the base of a wall were, for most practical purposes, safe from the defenders directly above. The star fort resolves this problem through geometry alone. By projecting triangular bastions outward from the corners or faces of the central polygon, the designers created lines of flanking fire, the ability to fire laterally along any wall face from a position on the adjacent bastion. An attacker moving toward any curtain wall is simultaneously exposed to fire from the two bastions flanking that section. An attacker targeting a bastion directly is caught in crossfire from the wall faces on either side. The result is a defensive geometry with no shelter points. Every surface of the fortification is covered from at least two angles simultaneously. It is an elegant, recursive solution to a specific tactical problem, and it works. Academic historians credit the development of this solution to a wave of military engineering innovation in Italy during the late 15th and early 16th centuries. The names associated with this tradition are real, and the documents they left behind are preserved and accessible. Francesco di Giorgio Martini, writing in the 1480s, produced treatises describing angular fortification principles that directly foreshadowed the full-trace italienne system. His manuscripts, held in collections including the Biblioteca Medicea Laurentiana in Florence, have been studied and analyzed extensively by architectural historians and are considered genuine working documents of his era. Antonio da Sangallo the Elder applied related principles in experimental fortifications in central Italy around the turn of the 16th century. Giuliano da Sangallo and Michelangelo were both involved in Florence's fortification projects in the early 16th century, a fact recorded in Florentine municipal records and in the extensive biographical literature of the Italian Renaissance. The design spread through Europe with documented momentum. The Italian wars of the late 15th and early 16th centuries brought French, Spanish, and later other European forces into direct contact with these new defensive systems, and military engineers of those powers adapted and adopted the approach. By the mid-16th century, formally trained engineers working in the Italian tradition were advising on projects across France, Spain, Portugal, and the Habsburg territories. Later, the French engineer Sébastien Leprestre de Vauban systematized the design under Louis XIV in the late 17th century to a degree that made his fortification works the standard professional reference across Europe for generations. His name appears in engineering manuals and military correspondence from England to Russia, and his documented influence on the field is enormous. By the late 16th century, the design was appearing in colonial settings. The Portuguese, establishing trading posts and fortified settlements across Asia and Africa, were among the earliest transmitters of the design outside Europe. That is a solid, documented lineage. The academic consensus rests on genuine archival evidence, named engineers, dated treatises, surviving correspondence, and architectural drawings. The chain of transmission is real, and the core of it is not seriously disputed. But here is where we need to be precise about what that chain actually explains and what it does not. When researchers working in historical archaeology and the comparative study of military architecture begin examining detailed measurements across star forts in different parts of the world, not just looking at their general profiles, but actually running the proportional mathematics, they find a degree of consistency across geographically separated examples that the colonial diffusion narrative has genuine difficulty accounting for fully. The Portuguese engineers who began construction of the fortification at Gala on the southern coast of what is now Sri Lanka in the late 1580s left records of their work. Dutch engineers who took control after 1640 undertook a significant expansion and redesign, and their records are even more detailed. The proportional relationships in the Dutch-era construction follow classical trace Italian conventions closely. British engineers who modified the structure further after 1796 left their own documentation in turn. Galles is one of the tidier cases. The chain of documented European involvement is clear and traceable through the colonial archive. But when we move to fort structures in inland South Asia, places where the documented involvement of formally trained European military engineers is thin, contested, or simply absent from the existing record, we sometimes find the same level of geometric precision. The angles achieve the flanking coverage they are supposed to achieve. The proportions fall within the same calculated ranges as the best documented European examples. How does a builder produce that level of precision from a rough description of a design seen once, transmitted through imperfect channels, using local materials and local construction methods that differ significantly from those of the original designers? That question does not prove anything by itself. But it appears in serious academic literature, and it has not received a fully satisfying answer. What do you think is really going on here? Does the precision across these structures feel fully explained by the colonial chain of transmission? Or does the consistency suggest something that the official story has not completely addressed? Tell me in the comments. I read every one, and the best discussions there shape what we bring to future episodes. Now let us pull back from individual structures and look at the full distribution problem. Because when you map every confirmed star fort or star fort profile earthwork on the planet, using a combination of historical cartographic records, colonial-era survey data, and modern satellite analysis, the pattern that emerges is genuinely difficult to contain within the frame of European colonial diffusion alone. The number of such structures documented worldwide runs into the hundreds. Researchers who apply a broader definition of the category, including earthwork enclosures with geometric bastion-like projections that predate the formal trace Italian tradition, place the total considerably higher. Europe itself is densely covered. Palma Nova in northeastern Italy, planned from the ground up as a complete fortified town, its construction beginning in 1593 under the direction of the Venetian Republic, is perhaps the most visually perfect surviving example of the fully realized design. Its street plan radiates outward from a central hexagonal plaza to 9 perfectly symmetrical bastions enclosing the town. It sits today within a UNESCO World Heritage designation, its geometry virtually unchanged. Bourtange in the Netherlands, Naarden, Coevorden, the extraordinary chain of fortifications along the French border redesigned by Vauban in the late 17th century. These are well preserved and well documented. The European record is solid. But now we move outward from Europe, and the paper trail thins at different rates in different directions. In North America, star fort structures appear along the Atlantic seaboard, in the Great Lakes region, across the Southern Territories, and here is where the distribution starts raising questions, at considerable distances from the coasts and from the earliest colonial settlements. Fort Jefferson, sitting in the dry Tortugas off the coast of Florida, is one of the most dramatic American examples. Construction began officially in 1846 and continued for decades without reaching full completion. The structure covers approximately 16 acres, and its walls are composed of more than 16 million individual bricks, making it the largest masonry fortification ever built in the United States. The documentation of its construction is thorough. Engineering correspondence, supply manifests, labor records, all accessible through the National Archive collections. Fort Jefferson fits the colonial timeline cleanly. It is a 19th century structure, built by documented engineering teams, and it raises no chronological puzzles. The structures that raise questions are different in character. They are older, less formally documented, and located further from the centers of early colonial presence. In the Mississippi and Ohio River valleys, there are earthwork enclosures documented in early American land surveys that have received less systematic scholarly attention than their East Coast counterparts. Some 19th century Army Corps of Engineers survey reports, published in the official series and accessible in National Archive collections, describe geometric embankment features in interior territories whose origins the surveyors noted as unclear. These were attributed, often in passing, to unspecified Native American construction. That attribution may well be accurate in many cases, but the features themselves, in some documented instances, display the angular projecting profile associated with deliberate bastion-style design, and the surveys note this resemblance without resolving it. In South Asia, the picture is more layered still. The Indian subcontinent holds dozens of major fortification complexes. At Bijapur, Golconda, Vellore, and scores of secondary sites across the Deccan Plateau and further south, whose architectural histories involve multiple overlapping phases of construction. Local rulers built. Earlier rulers had built before them. European colonial forces arrived and sometimes built again on top of existing structures, or recorded existing structures in their survey documents as if the construction history were their own. Untangling which layers are indigenous, which reflect European influence, and which represent local absorption of transmitted technique, is a genuine ongoing scholarly debate, and academic historians working on specific cases disagree in ways that have not been resolved. What is not in dispute is that some of these structures are large, old by the available dating evidence, and precisely built. The Golconda Fort complex outside Hyderabad, for example, has construction phases that architectural historians trace back to the Kakatiya dynasty of the 12th and 13th centuries, with major later phases attributed to the Bahmani Sultanate, and subsequently the Qutb Shahi rulers through the 16th and 17th centuries. The outer defensive works of the complex, as they survive today, reflect these layered phases. At what point in that layered history did the specific angular geometry associated with trace italienne appear? That is a question that architectural archaeologists are still working on, and the answer is not clean or settled. In East Asia, Japan's Goryokaku in Hakodate is the clearest and most straightforwardly documented example of intentional European-style trace italienne adoption outside the colonial sphere. Construction began in 1857 and was carried out by Japanese engineers who had explicitly studied Dutch military fortification design as part of Japan's broader program of deliberate military modernization. The documentation is unambiguous and the intentionality was explicit. Goryokaku is not a mystery in terms of its origins. And then there is the Siberian evidence, which almost never appears in English-language discussions of this phenomenon. Western Siberia, in the steppe and forest zone extending from the eastern Ural slopes toward the Ob River basin, contains a category of earthwork enclosure that Russian archaeologists have documented under the general term gorodishcha, roughly translatable as fortified enclosed places. These structures appear in Russian archaeological literature dating back to the late 19th century, with substantial survey work conducted during the Soviet period. Some of these earthworks display a degree of geometric regularity noted in aerial and later satellite analysis. The dating is genuinely contested. Some are confidently attributed to Bronze Age or Iron Age cultures. Others have produced material findings that resist clean chronological assignment. What is documented is that geometric earthwork construction in this region predates Russian colonial expansion by a meaningful margin in at least several cases. What is less settled is how old the oldest examples are and what tradition of engineering knowledge they represent. Excluding this material from a global discussion of geometric earthwork fortification is not methodologically honest, even if it is inconvenient for the neat colonial diffusion story. Here is something I want to spend real time on because it is the most underappreciated dimension of this entire question. It is not just about where these structures are located. It is about what building them actually required in terms of organized labor, material resources, surveying capability, and logistical infrastructure, and whether the historical record of the periods and places in question is consistent with those requirements. Let us start with the basic arithmetic of moving earth. A substantial star fort demands the excavation and controlled movement of enormous volumes of material. Even a mid-sized 5-bastion example, with the surrounding ditch and the elevated rampart walls built from the excavated earth, involves moving hundreds of thousands of cubic meters of soil and stone. The earth from the ditch goes into the walls. The walls must be compacted in layers to achieve the structural stability that allows them to absorb artillery impact without collapsing. The whole process requires sustained organization, continuous labor, and time measured in years rather than months. Fort Monroe in Virginia is a useful reference case because its documentation is thorough enough to give us a clear picture of what a major star fort construction project actually consumed. Begun in 1819, the fort required more than 15 years to reach functional completion. Its construction demanded sustained access to a significant workforce, including skilled military engineering personnel and large numbers of laborers performing the physical work, along with continuous supply chains for materials, tools, and provisions. The engineering correspondence from its construction period, preserved in the National Archive record, is detailed enough to allow researchers to track resource flows, labor disputes, construction delays, and logistical problems. It was a major institutional undertaking by the standards of its era. Now apply those resource demands to a remote colonial outpost, far from established supply routes, building in an unfamiliar climate, with a garrison of limited size and no established local infrastructure. The challenges multiply significantly. And yet, in several cases in the official historical record, exactly that kind of construction is described: remote, resource-limited, conducted by small teams, producing results that, in physical terms, represent a level of engineering output that strains the described constraints, not always impossibly, but uncomfortably. Several researchers who have worked on the quantitative dimensions of this question, comparing documented labor force sizes and construction durations against the volume of material that needed to be moved, have described what they call a consistency gap in specific cases. The record suggests that either the labor forces were larger than documented, the construction methods were substantially more efficient than we have evidence for, or the construction timeline in the official record does not tell the complete story. There is also the surveying dimension, which deserves careful attention. To build a star fort with the proportions required to achieve full flanking coverage, the tactical goal the whole design exists to serve. The layout must be accurate to within a meaningful tolerance. You cannot estimate your way to a working star fort. The angles must be right. Achieving correct angular layout across a structure 200 or 300 meters from side to side in irregular terrain requires instruments and the knowledge to deploy them accurately in field conditions. The instruments that existed in the early colonial period were real. The theodolite in early form was in use by the late 16th century. Chain and triangulation methods for angular measurement were part of the standard toolkit of European military engineers by the 17th century. We are not claiming that colonial engineers lacked the tools. We are asking whether those tools, in the hands of the documented teams in the documented locations, can account for every example of precision we observe. In well-served locations with continuous European engineering presence, the answer is clearly yes. In locations where that presence was intermittent or poorly documented, the answer is less obvious. A paper published in a Russian-language journal of historical architecture, cited in a later survey of Volga region earthwork structures, suggested that several fort complexes in that area appeared to incorporate pre-existing geometric earthwork features into their colonial period construction phases. The researcher proposed that Russian engineers in the 17th and 18th centuries may have built upon or into earlier earthwork profiles rather than starting from bare ground. If accurate in even some cases, this means the apparent precision of those structures owes something to an earlier, pre-European construction layer, a layer whose origin the paper deliberately declined to identify. That case may or may not be representative, but the methodological point it raises matters. If colonial engineers sometimes built on existing earthworks, then recording those structures as colonial construction in the official survey is technically accurate as far as it goes, and entirely misleading about what was already there. The accuracy of the colonial record and the existence of something earlier are not mutually exclusive. I promised you a map. Let us get to it, because the cartographic record is where some of the most specific and verifiable evidence in this discussion appears. Historical maps from the 17th, 18th, and early 19th centuries are not simply navigational documents. They are records of what their makers observed, or believed they observed, about the territories they were charting. Military survey maps in particular were serious professional documents, produced by trained engineers working for specific administrative purposes. They recorded what surveyors encountered in the field. They were used for planning by people whose competence and livelihoods depended on their accuracy. When such a map shows a geometric fortification structure in a specific location, that is a meaningful data point, even if it is not a proof of anything by itself. British military survey operations across the Deccan Plateau of central India expanded significantly in the early 19th century as East India Company control extended through the region following the conflicts with the Maratha Confederacy. The survey work of this period was systematic, conducted by trained military engineers using established triangulation methods developed during the Great Trigonometric Survey of India that began in 1802. The records of these operations, field notebooks, finished maps, accompanying descriptive reports, are preserved in the British Library and in former India Office Archive collections. Within those survey records, a significant number of fortification complexes are documented that the surveyors explicitly describe as existing structures rather than new colonial construction. The survey reports accompanying some of these entries note, sometimes briefly, sometimes in greater detail, that local informants placed the origin of the structures at a considerable remove in time. The language these colonial-era surveyors used was most often simply old or ancient, without specificity about what that designation meant to the informant or to the surveyor recording it. They were noting what they observed and what they were told, without necessarily accepting or questioning the implication. Several of the structures documented in these early 19th century surveys display, in the accompanying drawn plans, the characteristic bastion and curtain profile of trace Italian geometry. The colonial-era explanation, applied then and repeated since in the secondary literature, attributes these features to European influence transmitted through earlier political channels. The Bijapur Sultanate, active from the 15th through the 17th centuries, was known to have maintained working relationships with Portuguese traders and technical advisors. The Qutb Shahi rulers of Golconda similarly operated in a zone where European technical knowledge was accessible through trade and diplomatic contact. These are real historical channels through which geometric fortification design could plausibly have traveled. But that explanation works for the major urban centers with well-documented contact histories. It is considerably thinner for smaller secondary forts and earthwork enclosures across the interior plateau, where the European contact evidence in the available record is weak or entirely absent. And this is where the cartographic anomaly I want you to focus on becomes most pointed. There is a category of historical map known as a schematic survey, a rough-drawn record of a territory created not by formal triangulation methods, but by a traveler, merchant, or military officer recording what they observed or were told during transit through a region. These maps are numerous in the European colonial archive, and they precede the formal survey era, in most colonial territories by decades, or in some cases by much longer. They are imprecise by later professional standards, but they are records of something that someone observed or was reliably told. Some schematic surveys of interior Indian territories, documents produced in the late 17th and early 18th centuries before the formal British survey era in those areas, show geometric enclosure features in locations where the formal surveys conducted half a century or more later also documented fortification structures. The geographic correspondence between early schematic map and later formal survey is never exact. These were rough documents made with rough methods. But in several cases it is close enough to suggest that both were recording the same physical reality from different distances and different moments in time. If a schematic map drawn by a traveler in 1690 shows a geometric enclosure in a particular inland valley, and a formal military survey conducted in 1820 documents a fortified complex in approximately the same valley, and the formal survey describes that complex as clearly old and of unclear origin. What does that evidence suggest about when the structure was built? It does not prove anything with certainty, but it does make the standard colonial era construction date considerably harder to defend without additional evidence. What would you need to see to conclude that something in this picture does not fit the standard explanation? Tell me your thinking in the comments. That is exactly the question that serious researchers are working toward answering, and hearing how different people frame it matters. This is the part of the investigation I have been building toward, because the 19th century is not just the period in which most star forts were formally documented, surveyed, and incorporated into colonial administrative records. It is the century in which a specific and very powerful interpretive framework was constructed around the physical evidence of the past, a framework that determined what could be acknowledged, what had to be explained away, and what would simply be set aside without examination. During the 19th century, European colonial powers were engaged simultaneously in two enormous projects. The first was the physical project of territorial expansion, mapping, administering, and militarily securing territories across Asia, Africa, the Americas, and the Pacific. The second was the intellectual project of constructing a historical narrative that made that expansion legible and coherent, a narrative in which European civilization occupied the apex of human development, and in which evidence of sophisticated engineering or advanced construction in non-European contexts was systematically attributed to European transmission, explained as imitation, or quietly reclassified as less significant than it appeared. This is not a fringe argument invented by modern critics of colonialism. It is a well-documented pattern that has been analyzed in peer-reviewed historical scholarship since at least the mid-20th century. Historians of science, historians of cartography, and scholars working in the history of anthropological and archaeological thought have traced it in considerable detail. The figures who built the dominant 19th century interpretive frameworks, figures like Herbert Spencer and Lewis Henry Morgan in the English language tradition, were not simply prejudiced individuals. They were operating within an intellectual structure that had genuine institutional authority, and the conclusions they reached were absorbed into academic disciplines, colonial administrative practice, and popular understanding in ways that persisted long after the explicit assumptions were challenged. What this means for the starfort question is specific and consequential. When British, French, Dutch, and Portuguese administrators and their academic counterparts encountered fortification structures in colonial territories, structures whose origins were unclear, whose construction histories were not in European records, and whose technical sophistication was difficult to attribute to the peoples the colonial framework classified as less advanced, the default interpretive move was to assume European origin or European influence. Sometimes this assumption was argued for explicitly. More often, it was simply built into the categorization without examination, baked into the baseline of the official record. The colonial survey documents, the documents that later historians relied on as primary sources, reflect that assumption throughout. A structure with geometric bastions in a colonial territory was, in the colonial administrative imagination, either built by Europeans, modified by Europeans, or influenced by Europeans. Local traditions attributing the structure to indigenous construction before European contact were classified as legend, misremembering, or romantic myth. And since the colonial survey records are often the oldest surviving written documentation for these structures in any European language, later historians working from those records inherited the interpretation together with the data. The circularity was invisible because the assumption was buried in the baseline. In South Asian architectural history, some of the most important revisionist work has been done since the 1970s. Scholarship that takes seriously the mathematical and engineering sophistication of pre-colonial Indian traditions and demonstrates that geometric precision in South Asian architecture did not require European transmission. The indigenous mathematical tradition, documented in texts ranging from the Sulba Sutras of the first millennium BCE to the sophisticated astronomical and computational literature of the Kerala School of Mathematics in the 14th through 16th centuries, was capable of producing the geometric reasoning that trace italienne design requires. That capability existed independently, and its existence has now been documented thoroughly enough to make the old colonial assumption very difficult to sustain as a blanket explanation. But this revisionist work has been slow to reshape the popular understanding of the starfort question, because popular understanding is still largely shaped by sources that were themselves written within the 19th century colonial framework. The assumption that these structures are primarily European products, diffused outward by colonial expansion, is still the default in many places where the question comes up, because it was baked into the oldest, most widely cited, and most institutionally authoritative sources. If you have been following this channel for a while, you will recognize this as a pattern we come back to again and again. The 19th century, not simply as a historical period, but as a machine for producing explanations that have outlasted the assumptions that generated them. If this is your first episode, and this kind of layered historical analysis is what you are looking for, honest, careful, sourced, not inflating the mystery beyond what the evidence supports, but also not pretending that questions have been answered when they have not, then subscribe now and come back for the next episode. Where we are going next involves a category of document that most history channels have never touched, and it makes this look like a starting point rather than a destination. So here we are at the end, and I want to be completely straight with you about where this investigation has actually landed. We began with a shape, a star, a geometrically precise, globally distributed form that appears on every continent, pressed into earthworks and stone, in locations ranging from thoroughly documented colonial military sites to places where the colonial record is thin, contradictory, or altogether absent. We have walked through the geometry, the global distribution, the engineering arithmetic, the cartographic evidence, and the 19th century interpretive framework that shaped how all of it was recorded and categorized. What do we actually know? We know that the trace Italian design has a well-documented European origin in the 15th and 16th centuries, with named engineers, surviving treatises, and a credible chain of transmission through European colonial expansion. That part of the story is solid, and I am not challenging it. We know that the global distribution of star fort-style structures is broader and more geometrically consistent than the colonial diffusion narrative alone can comfortably explain in every documented case. Some examples fit the transmission model cleanly. Others do not, and the discrepancies have been noted by academic researchers working in mainstream institutions publishing in mainstream journals. We know that the engineering demands of the larger and more remote examples put pressure on the resource timelines embedded in the official historical record. The numbers are not always impossible. They are sometimes uncomfortable. We know that historical survey maps record structures in locations and with characteristics that the standard timeline has difficulty accounting for. Some of these cases have received scholarly attention. Many have not. We know that the 19th century interpretive framework systematically attributed sophisticated construction in non-European contexts to European transmission, sometimes on the basis of assumption rather than documented evidence. That framework shaped the foundational sources that later historians inherited. What we do not know is what all of this points toward definitively. The evidence is genuinely consistent with more than one conclusion, and the intellectually honest response to that is to name the possibilities rather than collapse them prematurely into a single answer. One possibility is that the colonial diffusion model is essentially correct, and the apparent anomalies are primarily products of incomplete documentation. The record has gaps. Surveys were imperfect. Timelines in colonial records are approximate. Filling in the gaps with the known history produces a coherent picture even if specific details remain unresolved. This is the mainstream academic position, and it rests on real evidence. A second possibility is that the trace italienne design had partial precursors and parallel antecedents, regional traditions of geometric fortification construction in parts of the world outside Renaissance Europe, and that what we see in the global distribution reflects a convergence of independent development alongside documented colonial transmission. This view has been argued in academic literature, particularly in the context of South Asian fortification history, and it does not require positing any single hidden origin for the pattern. A third possibility is that some portion of the structures we classify as star forts represents construction that predates the colonial period by a meaningful margin, and that the colonial record attributed that construction to its own era without adequate investigation of what was already there when European engineers arrived. This is the hardest claim to demonstrate and the hardest to dismiss cleanly, because the systematic archaeological investigation that would settle it, careful stratigraphy and radiometric dating across multiple examples on multiple continents, has in most cases not been conducted. That last point is where I want to leave you tonight, because I think it is the most consequential. The absence of systematic archaeological investigation of the chronological questions surrounding this global pattern is itself a significant evidentiary fact. It does not prove the alternative timeline, but it does mean that the confidence with which the official timeline is asserted in many specific cases rests on the absence of contradicting evidence rather than on the presence of confirming investigation. A claim that has never been seriously tested is not the same as a claim that has been tested and confirmed. Those are different epistemic positions, and treating them as equivalent is how historical questions get prematurely closed. The honest answer is this: we do not know the full story of who built every star fort on this planet. We know the documented story of some of them. The rest is genuinely open in the academic sense, where serious researchers continue to publish and disagree, not merely in the speculative sense, where anything goes. Now I want to hear from you. We have covered the geometry that holds across thousands of miles, the engineering volumes that strain the documented timelines, the cartographic record that shows structures where the standard narrative places nothing, and the 19th century framework that shaped how all of it was categorized and explained. Which piece of this struck you hardest? Where do you think the standard explanation holds, and where do you think it starts to pull apart? Leave it below. The comments section on this channel is a real conversation, and some of the most important follow-up investigations we have done started from a question that appeared there. The 19th century is full of buried cases. The Star Fort question is one of the largest, but it is not the only one. In the next episode, we go inside a different category of physical evidence, one that the official record classifies as settled, but where the settlement, when you trace it back through its sources, depends on a chain of 19th century assumptions that were never subjected to independent verification. I am not going to name it before we are ready, but I will tell you this. It involves a document, a location, and a date, and all three of them cannot be true at the same time. Subscribe and be here when it drops. My name is Elliot Carter. This is Epoch Reset, and we are only just beginning.